Hey, this is Chris with Phoenix Gaming. We're going to do another Warhammer Fantasy episode. Today we're going to talk about movement. This should cover everything we didn't cover before. We're going to talk about everything that was left out of the last episode: compulsory moves, rallying, fleeing, charging fleeing units, all of the other charge rules, moving backwards and sideways, marching, what enemy sighted is, lone models, skirmish movement, moving off the board, etc. So it's going to be kind of a big one again, but like I said, this is going to be the most complicated part of the game. Compulsory moves and fleeing. You start with rallying. Each fleeing unit a player has must make a leadership test. If it's passed, the unit stops fleeing and is allowed an immediate reform. If the unit has 25% or less of its starting strength, it only rallies on double ones or snake eyes. If the test is failed, the unit continues to flee. If for any reason that unit started to flee in the current turn, it cannot rally. If the unit ends up fleeing, or you have to make a fleeing compulsory movement, you move 2d6 inches in the direction you are facing. Fleeing through enemies or impassable terrain will cause you to make dangerous terrain tests, which we will talk about in a later episode, but they will ignore terrain and other units for all other purposes. If a fleeing unit moves through another friendly unit, that friendly unit must make a panic test as soon as the fleeing unit finishes its move. And fleeing units that come into contact with the table edge are removed as casualties and count as being destroyed. That's a lot of words to basically just say if you fail your leadership check, or for whatever reason you're fleeing, you roll 2 dice. That's how many inches you move. You go in the direction you are currently facing at the start of the movement phase. And if you flee through models or impassable terrain, you roll some dice and see how many guys die. That's really what it boils down to. We'll cover it in detail when we go over terrain. That's going to be another bigger series of videos. If you move through friendly units, they have to make panic tests. If they fail, then they start fleeing. And that's where it can get a little weird, because if you have one bad leadership check, that can cascade into half your army just running away in a single turn, and it can get rough. Leadership is probably the one area this game needs the most love, and that is also one of the areas that GW has come out and said, hey, we are going to work on that. So, and then as usual, if they come into contact with the table edge, they're removed as casualties, they count as destroyed. Pretty straightforward. Now that we've talked about fleeing and how that works, if you charge a fleeing unit, if that charge is completed, you move the charging unit in contact with the fleeing unit as normal, and then the fleeing unit just dies. And it's basically like the combat resolution panic test, which again we'll get into later. But really all it means is that if you're running away and I charge you, if I make that charge, you die. That's it. There's no attacks, there's no leadership, there's no nothing. You just pick up your whole unit, whatever's left. So leadership can be a very important mechanic in this game. Keep that in mind. It is an old war game, and leadership was much more important in older games than it is in newer games. Some other charge rules you need to keep in mind. You have flank and rear charges, and where you hit your target is based on your alignment to the enemy based on its location before the charge. And that's just a roundabout way of saying, hey man, look at the picture on the screen. If you're in the front arc of the enemy, you have to charge the front arc. If you're in the side, you have to charge the side. If you're in the rear, you have to charge the rear. It's pretty straightforward. If the unit covers both the side and the rear, it's whatever it is mostly in. So like a good example is if you look at number 3 on the screen there, you've got that unit of 5 Goblin Wolf Riders. 2 of them are in the side, 3 of them are in the rear. So obviously you have to charge the rear. It's pretty straightforward, and it'll generally make sense. There's going to be times where you're like, oh gosh, I don't know. It's going to be close. And when you come to those, honestly, your best course of action, in my opinion, is to either roll off for it, or if I'm the charging player, I just say, hey man, it's close enough that I'm going to hit the least advantageous side for me. And that's just kind of my approach to the game anyway, is if something's close, I just give it to whomever I'm playing. I don't care. I'm more about keeping the game going. I'm more about keeping the game fun than making sure like I can nitpick that little 16th of an inch in order to be like, haha, I get this in the back, you know. Other charge rules: if you're charging one enemy unit with two or more of your units, you will roll and move units at the same time and use your movement to maximize the total number of models in combat. That's a lot of words. And again, it really just means, hey, if I'm charging you with Unit A and I'm charging you with Unit B, and they're both in your front arc, for example, when I finish the charge, I have to do it in a way that gets the most number of models in combat. It doesn't matter how many in each unit are in, it just matters how many total. So you can't block yourself out of combat if you've declared the charge. You have to make room for each other and you have to maximize the amount of models you can get in. Sometimes you're going to get a unit that can charge, but it can't close the door. And that's that free wheel to kind of close the gap sometimes. And when that happens, look at the picture on the screen. Figure 1, you see those same Wolf Riders are charging a unit of infantry, but the terrain blocks them from closing the door, as it were. And when that happens, you just take the defending unit and you close the door with them if you can. And really all you're doing is you're just closing the gap however you can. It doesn't really matter. What's more important is just getting the gap closed. And we've covered most of the charging now. I think that's almost everything you're going to encounter in the charge phase outside of some really rare stuff. So now we're going to talk about some of the other options you have for moving. You have marches, and when you do a march order, it's just doubling the movement of the unit, but you cannot do a march order if you're within 8 inches of an enemy model unless you pass a leadership. So you have to roll the leadership to see if you can march. Marching units may not reform, and they may not move backwards or to the side, but they do wheel as normal, and a unit that marches can't shoot. So there's going to be a very similar interaction if you played any GW games. Basically, if you advance, right? That's the terminology we use for 40K. I believe it's running in AOS now. If you advance, you get to double your movement, but you can't reform, so you can't change your formation at all, and you can't sidestep and you can't rear march, but you can only forward march. And when you forward march, you'll still get your wheel movements as normal. And you can't shoot, so you can't advance or run and shoot. Units that have one model, honestly, so the way it's written in the rules, they move like everything else in the game. They do wheels, they do this, they do that. There's one exception. They are allowed as many pivots as they like. And what that really means is that they get to move kind of like 40K models, because you get to move, pivot, move, pivot, move, pivot. So it's one of those where it's not quite as free as 40K, but it's about as close as you're going to get to being as free as you can in 40K, because you can just pivot 10 degrees, move an inch, pivot 10 degrees, move an inch, pivot 10 degrees, move an inch, etc. So, like I said, it says on there it moves like 40K models, and for most intents and purposes, they do. It's a little bit slower, it's a little bit more choppy, but for all intents and purposes, that's effectively how they're going to move. Keep in mind that charges don't actually allow pivots, so they must charge like all other units. So when your characters, if they're not attached to a unit, if they charge something, they still have just their one wheel, and that's it. Which is going to be really weird because it's such a tiny little base. Like you get it's a weird interaction, but that's how it works. You can sidestep or rear march. If you do either, you move at half rate, which is you divide your movement by 2. So if it's an odd number, like elves have a 5-inch movement, you actually get to round it up to the nearest inch. So most infantry are going to move 2 inches sideways or 2 inches backwards, 4 inches forwards. And then elves are going to move 3 inches sideways, 3 inches backwards, 5 inches forwards. You cannot combine these different movements. You only get to forward or backward move or sideways move. So if you sidestep, you only get to sidestep. If you rear march, you only get to rear march. And if you forward march, you only get to forward march. You can't combo them. Here's some more movement rules because we haven't covered enough of them yet. We're going to talk about skirmishers. And skirmishers and light cavalry are very similar. I don't think I did a slide for light cavalry, but we will touch on them with this right now. Skirmishers still have a formation. You can see on the picture, it's the same as a regular formation. It's just kind of blown out. Everything's a ½ inch, which I haven't played a lot of 8th edition, so this was kind of an eye-opener for me, because in the older editions, you just had a coherency rule, and they moved like AOS models, or they moved like 40K models. And now they still have to maintain an actual formation, but you put a ½ inch gap between all the models. And that one's kind of weird to me. I don't really understand why, other than maybe it just keeps it easier for when you get charged. But they still have a formation. If they are charged, they tighten up, and all that means is you just push all the bases together. Again, this was a rule change that felt kind of weird and clunky to me. It probably speeds up the game a little bit when they do get charged, and that's, I'm guessing, the intention. But they are, if they're charged, their formation tightens up as normal. They are allowed to reform as many times as it likes the unit, as long as no models move more than the move. So if they have a 4-inch movement, you can reform and do whatever you want. Models just can't move more than 4 inches. Or double that if they marched. And again, this is going to be as close to 40K as you're going to get with this. And actually, your light cavalry will work the same way in this regard. They're going to be allowed as many reforms as they like. And really, that just lets you basically move them and reposition them however you want to. That's the easiest way for me to explain it to people, is I can just be like, okay, I want to move from point A to point B, but I also want to do a 180, and they get to do that. They can march and shoot at a -1 to hit. Again, light cavalry do the same thing. For all intents and purposes, light cavalry is just skirmishers for cavalry. They get 0 rank bonuses in melee, which means they don't count. They can't be steadfast or claim a flank or rear bonus. And it just means they don't really contribute to the combat resolution in a lot of ways. They can still be useful in combat because you can use them to tag something and then hit them on the sides and rear with other things. But ultimately, a lot of your skirmish units are going to be more like, there's some Wood Elf archers that get it. There's some, like, a lot of archer units are going to be the ones that typically have it. Characters that join a skirmisher unit also gain skirmisher while it's in the unit. And that just is a simple rule to say, hey, this exists. We're going to give it to everything so it doesn't break the unit. We're going to talk about reinforcements. Units that enter from reinforcements are placed within contact of a board edge, and they have to be wholly within double their movement of the board edge. So if their movement is 4, the unit has to be wholly within 8, and the rear rank has to be touching the table edge. And the whole rear rank has to be touching it, and they have to be facing the battlefield. So the easiest way to tell you is, like, you just set them down as if they walked onto the table edge. Pretty straightforward. Again, it's a lot of words to say something that's very simple and very concise. Units that come from reinforcements may not charge and they may not march, but they can otherwise move and shoot normally. Regardless of if it moves, it counts as having moved for the purposes of shooting. So if you come from reserves or reinforcements, you are always treated as if you move that turn, even if you don't, at least when it comes to shooting. Here's even more movement rules, because we haven't gotten enough of those yet. And we're going to talk about musicians. And what they do is, the first thing, they give a tiebreaker when resolving combat. And like I said, we're going to talk about all that later. There's going to be a whole series of videos that talk about melee and combat resolution. Just know that musicians can help in combat resolution. They get the ability called Form on Me. And what that does is, if a unit is fleeing, if it has a musician, you get to add one to your leadership when you attempt to rally. Now, the only thing that won't affect is if you're under 25% of your starting strength, because that rule specifically states you can only pass it on double ones. Units with musicians may attempt to make a swift reform. And when you do, you say, hey, I'm going to make a swift reform. Then you make a leadership check. If the leadership check fails, you only get to make a normal reform, and you count as making the reform whether you made it or not. So you can't be like, I'm going to make a leadership check. Oh, I failed it. I guess I'm going to charge. You have to just make the reform, and that's what you get to do. If you pass it, you get to make the reform, but you're also allowed to make a normal move, and you can also still shoot, but you count as having moved regardless. So what that means is you're -1 to your hit rolls for moving and shooting, and you cannot shoot, move, or fire weapons. You're going to have some handguns and stuff like that have this ability called move or fire, and it's exactly what it sounds like. So if you do a free reform, that unit, if they have those weapons won't get to shoot. This isn't going to cover it. Like I said, there's a lot to unpack in the movement phase. I'm surprised that this video stayed under 20 minutes. We're going to probably work our way through the magic next. Although that's probably the one I need to cover the least, because that was something that was already said is getting changed. But it'll probably be magic and or combat and then shooting. We'll probably do shooting last in that series of things, because shooting isn't nearly as common as magic and melee. So we want to get to those first. The other thing I will say is I know some of you are missing my Drukhari content. I do have some stuff that's going to be coming out this week, and we're going to do a recap on the tournament that I'll be doing coming up here soon as well. So it's just one of those, like, I am getting back into it. We are starting to make videos again. Everything's picking up. So be prepared for an increase in volume, and it's not going to get crazy. I'm probably going to do 1 to 2 a week. Like, it's not going to get nuts. And then we're going to try to do some sort of live stream. I'm not streaming games right now. We're just focusing on just content and discussions. And part of that is because a lot of my game space is being taken up for the work that I'm doing for GW. And I need to get that all done, packed up, and shipped out before I can even worry about streaming games. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Big shout out to my immortals, Captain Too Tall, the real Donnie G, Lord Wellingstone, and Daniel Bodecker. You guys are awesome. I appreciate everything you do for the community. I look forward to working with you all in future events. I know Lord Wellingstone, he's actually the organizer for the upcoming AOS tournament I'll be going to. And links on the screen, links in the description. You guys have a fantastic day.